Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're jumping right into one of the most absolutely absurd, bizarre, and honestly just utterly fascinating corporate deals in modern history. Picture this, okay? It's the height of the Cold War. Geopolitical tensions are literally at a boiling point, the Iron Curtain is firmly drawn, and two global superpowers are locked in a massive standoff. And right in the middle of this high-stakes chess match steps an American soft drink company. Yep, we're going to explore the incredibly unlikely series of events that pulled Pepsi right into the world of international diplomacy, massive barter economies, and how they somehow ended up securing a literal fleet of military weapons. Now, you might have seen this claim floating around the internet. The legend goes that for a brief, glorious moment, the makers of your favorite fizzy cola possessed a combat-ready fleet so massive, it actually outgunned most sovereign nations, briefly becoming the sixth largest navy on the entire planet. I mean, it sounds like the plot of a ridiculous Hollywood comedy, right? Okay, let's dive into this and separate the historical facts from the viral fiction. 17. That is the exact quantity of attack submarines that PepsiCo acquired from the Soviet Union. Let that sink in. Not delivery trucks, not bottling plants, 17 military submarines. So how on earth does a snack and beverage brand end up holding the keys to apocalyptic military hardware? Well, to understand this mystery, we really have to go back to the very beginning. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer, tracking this wild corporate thriller across 3 decades. We've got the 1959 kitchen debate, the 1972 first vodka deal, the infamous 1989 warship deal, and finally, the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union. Part 1, the kitchen debate and a taste of capitalism. Let's set the scene. It's 1959, and at an American exhibition in Moscow, U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev are locked in a pretty heated argument. But seeing a golden PR opportunity, this really ambitious Pepsi executive manages to get a paper cup of American soda right into the hands of the Soviet leader. And Khrushchev's reaction? Well, he took a few cautious sips and declared, "This is very refreshing." He even asked for a second cup. Naturally, photographs of the Soviet premier enjoying a Pepsi were printed in newspapers all over the globe. It was an absolute, massive global public relations coup for the American brand. They had literally pierced the Iron Curtain with sugar and carbonation. But just as a humorous historical footnote, not everyone in the Khrushchev family was entirely convinced. Sergei Khrushchev, the premier's son, later recalled that the drink, in his opinion, smelled like shoe wax. Okay, so mixed behind-the-scenes reviews aside, the Soviet public quickly developed a serious taste for the American beverage. The demand was absolutely there, and Pepsi eagerly wanted to tap into this massive, completely closed-off consumer market. So the crucial point is there was a massive economic hurdle blocking their path. The Soviet ruble was not a convertible currency. Basically, this means it couldn't be readily bought, sold, or traded on the global market. Because of the tightly closed Soviet economy, a ruble was essentially worthless outside the borders of the USSR. The Soviets couldn't just write Pepsi a check in US dollars, and Pepsi obviously had zero use for millions of untradable rubles. If they wanted to do business, they had to get incredibly creative. Which brings us to part 2, trading cola for vodka. To bypass the whole worthless ruble situation, Pepsi and the Soviet government turned to one of the oldest economic practices in human history, direct bartering. Basically, they decided to trade liquid for liquid. In 1972, they struck a truly historic deal. Pepsi agreed to provide their concentrated cola syrup, which would then be bottled locally right there in the Soviet Union. And in exchange, they received the exclusive U.S. distribution rights to Stolichnaya vodka, along with some Soviet and Eastern Bloc wines. This was a brilliant maneuver that completely bypassed the currency issue, making Pepsi the very first foreign consumer product to be sold in the USSR. And as a bonus, it completely locked out their rivals at Coca-Cola for over a decade. It was a highly lucrative win-win for both sides. By the late 1980s, Soviets were knocking back 1 billion servings of Pepsi every single year. But geopolitical tensions soon threw a massive wrench into the whole machine. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The resulting outrage triggered a widespread U.S. consumer boycott of Russian products. American dockworkers even flat-out refused to unload the cargo. Suddenly, America's love affair with Russian vodka went right down the drain, leaving Pepsi with a massive, thirsty Soviet market, but no practical way to get paid. And that leads us to part 3, submarines for syrup. Fast forward to the late 80s, and the Soviets were desperate to keep the Pepsi flowing, but they were entirely out of hard cash and tradable vodka. So they proposed a truly absurd alternative. They offered to pay Pepsi in outdated military seacraft. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the utter absurdity of these items appearing on a corporate balance sheet. A brand famously known for selling snacks and soda suddenly acquired 17 submarines, valued at roughly $150,000 each, along with a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. It's just an amazing snapshot of the late Cold War era, where a massive corporation essentially accepts a small armada in exchange for soda pop. The irony of the whole situation definitely wasn't lost on Pepsi's leadership either. Donald Kendall, the CEO of PepsiCo, famously quipped to Brent Scowcroft, the U.S. National Security Advisor at the time, "We're disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." It's such a hilarious juxtaposition. Through the pure mechanics of capitalist commerce, a soda company was physically removing warships from the Soviet arsenal. Part 4, the myth debunked. Middlemen, not admirals. All right, it's time to address the elephant in the room. Did this wild deal actually make Pepsi the 6th largest navy in the world? Let's strictly debunk this internet legend right now. And this brilliantly illustrates the reality of the situation. The truth is much less cinematic, but honestly, equally fascinating from a business perspective. The fleet was basically junk. These were heavily decommissioned, rusting cast-offs. They were completely stripped of their weapons, not seaworthy in the slightest, and absolutely not combat ready. Pepsi had absolutely no capability nor any desire to orchestrate military maneuvers. A rusting submarine confers zero actual military power. The actual mechanics of the naval barter were strictly financial. Pepsi didn't hire sailors or go build a secret naval base. They acted purely as a third-party middleman. They formed a joint venture with a Norwegian shipping company. The very moment that decommissioned fleet was transferred as payment, it was immediately routed to a Scandinavian shipyard where it was broken down and sold for scrap metal. Pepsi walked away with a clean profit of about $3 million, which funded their continued expansion. So the ownership was merely a fleeting, highly technical accounting maneuver. But wait, it gets better. Emboldened by this success, Pepsi actually doubled down on bartering the very next year. In 1990, they signed the largest ever transaction between an American company and the Soviet Union, a staggering $3 billion deal. This time, instead of rusting submarines, the Soviets agreed to build at least 10 brand new commercial freighters and oil tankers. Pepsi and their partners would then lease or sell these civilian ships on the international market to fund new bottling plants and even launch Pizza Hut in Moscow. But as we know, history had other plans. Just months later in 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapsed. The Iron Curtain fell, and the nation completely splintered into independent republics. Pepsi's multi-billion-dollar contract was suddenly held with a non-existent entity, rendering it completely void. As Pepsi frantically scrambled to negotiate with a bunch of fractured new governments just to rebuild their supply chain, their rivals at Coca-Cola swooped right into the newly opened Russian market, seizing the opportunity and quickly overtaking them. So, what does this all mean? What should you take away from all this? Well, the Pepsi Navy is a bizarre, hilarious footnote in history for sure, but it's also a pretty profound lesson in how creative trade can bridge massive ideological divides. It really leaves us with a fascinating question to end on. In an interconnected global economy, do modern corporations wield as much diplomatic power as nations? It's definitely something to ponder as you reflect on the strange ways capitalism, bartering, and diplomacy intertwine. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.